Okay, we've officially started recording.
Okay, perfect. All right, so you are going to be speaking to about 30 of the second year creative writing students. So just to give you a little info on that, this will be kind of like their first creative writing class at university. We've done some workshops together and we've discussed a little bit of your work, which we can talk about. But first, I'd just like to introduce you if I can. And do correct me if I get anything wrong. So Gahl Liberzon is a writer. He's the author of the collection Bodies, 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 which is out from Redbeard Press. He has been also a spoken word educator and has taught a lot about writing and anything else. Oh, and he won the prestigious Hopwood Prize for Poetry at the University of Michigan. For a collection of poems. I forgot that. Okay. Anything else that you want me to shout out about you? And lives in Japan.
We're just talking about like spoken word related things.
Just anything to do with kind of your work and your writing and and you've now you're kind of branching out and doing some stand-up comedy as well.
Yeah, I mean I've gone through a lot of different mediums. So I did spoken word for a while. I've done some short story writing. I've done improv comedy. I'm working on stand-up now. I'll probably go back into short fiction. I've done CNF. It's creative nonfiction. I don't know if that's an American term, but and then there's also been some branching into sort of therapeutics. So the spoken word education program that I was involved in was partially connected to what was called at the time CASTLE, which were Common Assessments in Socio-Emotional Learning. So we were actually working on teaching teenagers sort of coping strategies looped into that. And at the same time, I was doing some development of sort of a creative writing therapy sort of manual for potential use in University of Haifa. I don't know if that ever got off the ground. These sorts of arts therapy things kind of go in and out of fashion. But that's something I'm hoping to potentially look at in the future as a sort of research interest in psychology. Not necessarily about spoken word, but the idea of narrative construction and authorship as a form of therapeutic practice.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Gahl. So welcome and thank you so much for being here. We are going to talk a little bit about, why don't we start by talking about the work that you wrote that students will already have seen, which is, the title is The Definition of Poetry, and it's from your book. Why don't you, I'll give you a sense of kind of what we discussed together as a class. But why don't you start out and just explain a little bit why would you title this poem The Definition of Poetry, or what's kind of informing that?
Okay, yeah. I mean, there's two reasons that I can answer that question, right? One is sort of the initial reason of why I happened on the concept, which is sort of the origin story of the poem. And then there's the secondary one, which is, anything that's been published. I'm sure your class already knows this, but you've revised it, 10, 15, maybe 20 times. Why did I settle and stay with that? In this case, they kind of coalesce. So the reason it originally came about was that the writing workshop that I wrote this in was designed for, I think, high schoolers. And I was just sort of there as a guest instructor. But, it's sort of our position that if you're going to be assigning a writing assignment to a group, and that group is smaller than 30, right? If there's enough room for everyone to actually read, then the guest instructor will write alongside to sort of model that behavior and to share with them. And this particular one was on how we define poetry for ourselves. It was sort of an Ars Poetica style workshop. And the first part was brainstorming, and people were just kind of originally shouting out what they thought the definition of poetry was, and then sort of getting more and more creative and abstract and sort of jokey. So it started out with the definition of poetry is, words that set your heart on fire, or like, for the more romantic kids, or words arranged into formal structures by people that are a little bit more analytical. But, one of the people brought in, he's like, my 7-year-old niece said that poetry is turtles. I think that's really true. And so people were kind of like joking about that, and I liked that idea, and that's sort of where the poem sprang from, was this idea of to take the one of these definitions and then expand upon it into an ars poetica. And for me, I wanted to take the definition that was the most out there, the most difficult, and at the time that was neckbeards, right? Which I think was someone just sort of free associating, for those two in your class, or maybe a little bit not removed from the cultural milieu that I came from. And when I was a younger man and in the U.S., like a neckbeard was specifically a reference to these the sort of personality type of young, sort of pseudo intellectual classicist, like the types of people that would unironically read Shakespearean sonnets in public, kind of as an affectation. Right. So when they're saying poetry is neckbeards, to them, what they're really saying is like poetry is like dudes I don't like shouting nonsense at me and pretending it's cultured. You know, and for me, it was kind of like, first of all, I wanted to explore that more. And secondly, when I was thinking about it for myself, and this is kind of why I held on to it, is that like, in essence, I do think that that poem is about the function of poetry for me, which is about bridging the gap between, a frame of reference that I'm comfortable with and normal and can relate to, and a perspective or a viewpoint that I would normally be alienated from or disgusted by or distant from.
Right.
And so like the act of the poem itself is about bridging that distance between me and the quote unquote neckbeard that I might otherwise scoff at.
Yeah. Okay. Great. That's excellent. Yeah, we talked a lot about that, but I think it's wonderful to hear it directly from you. Do you mind talking a little bit more about Ars Poetica? Because this happens to be something that we did a little bit of work on as a class. I posted some resources on our like electronic learning about Ars Poetica and a lot of examples of poems that are Ars Poeticas. But do you mind like giving your definition of what an Ars Poetica is and a little bit more info on that?
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, in Ars Poetica, I mean, we tend to use this in the realm of poetry to talk specifically about poetry, but I think you can do it in general. It's sort of like an artist's statement, or a statement of intent about what you believe the purpose of what you're doing is and why you're owning your craft. So I know historically it's usually taken on relatively like a political weight when people mention Ars Poetica. They're like, I'm writing to create a new way of communicating with people that is liberated from like extant power structures, or I'm writing poems specifically because they're non-commercial, right? Sort of like this kind of communist feeling, like we have to write things that have no market value.
Well, we do that anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And then some other people that are really concerned with sort of classic concerns about aesthetics. For me, I always felt like it was a very humanist exercise to write poems, to really sort of get in touch with the parts that make us feel more human and humane towards one another, and to try and create a social space, especially like speaking as a man in a relatively masculine world, to kind of make a socially acceptable space to be a little bit more softer and a little bit more well-rounded, and like allowing people to like have their feelings without having to put up the front that we normally have to about like the societal expectations, which for a dude might be to kind of like hold that back or not show it, or for a girl might be, other sort of certain emotions are acceptable and certain emotions are unacceptable, right? So I think like that you can see in both of those situations, or really in all genders, whatever, like just like having a space in artistic expression where you are allowed to be either ambiguous or to have mixed emotions or to show emotions and depth of feeling that would not otherwise be acceptable.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about empathy. I think that's really great. And this kind of statement about the definition of poetry showing some of your philosophy as a writer, which involves kind of bringing in an alien perspective and trying to reconcile it with your own. I think that's really great. What do you think, kind of on another level, what do you think about the form of that piece? Because it's kind of, I think it's an interesting piece because the first three words of the title are also the first three words of the piece. And also it kind of is, I would say it's kind of straddling this gap between maybe like a kind of microfiction or like a short fiction, like a really short fiction, and a prose poem.
Right.
So what do you think about kind of the form of it? Because it doesn't have line breaks. It's all kind of one thing. Um, Maybe is there anything else also that you want to call our attention to? But like, what do you think kind of inspires that, or influences your choice of form in that poem, or in general?
No, that's an excellent question. Yeah, because typically when you think of prose poems, or even short fiction,
Mm-hmm.
there's a tendency to think of it as kind of like excused from formalism, um, or formal concerns about visual organization, how it looks on a page, how it draws the reader through, in terms of what their eye does, right, from like a design perspective. Whereas when you're doing poems with line breaks, you have to think like, how much space do I want to have between the words? How do I want to draw the reader's eye through the page? Um, and in this case, you're right that I think it is certainly narrative and structure, but there is almost a poetic decision here. And the reason why I'm being pretentious enough to talk about it being a poetic decision as opposed to just like, me fucking laying it out on the page as is. Sorry, am I allowed to be vulgar?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay, yeah. So for your students, pardon my French.
They're university. They can handle it.
Great. So F-bombs for everybody. Fuck it all. But yeah, so I originally did post that thinking that, yeah, it was a continuation of the title because I wanted it to feel almost like a rabbit hole that you fall into, right? Mm-hmm. That it's not only in sentence format, but that it's one continuous line. And for a long time, there was no line break in the poem or even paragraph break in the poem, even though there are sentences, right? So that it like the whole piece functions as one extended metaphor, right? The whole idea is one continuous idea. The definition of poetry is ... until you reach the end, at which point you've already transformed yourself into this other thing. And like I do like the idea of the cadence of literary prose, specifically because it has this effect of feeling prosaic, of feeling normal, of feeling almost non-poetic, and kind of a little bit more grounded than poetry can tend to be, which I've seen a lot of people use in more surreal poems that use prose poems. I think we're going to talk about this later, maybe, if we have time today. One of my favorite poets, Charles Simic, does this a lot, where he does really short prose poems that are incredibly surreal, right? So you'll just be reading a sentence in the course of like 17 words. You almost won't notice that, a shadow has turned into a cat that has eaten your mother. But like, I wanted to use that, but in a little bit more of a subtle way, that like you start out thinking that this is really grounded and realistic, and like we're just getting a sort of character profile, and then sort of by the end of it, kind of in like if you ever heard of the David Cronenberg film like The Fly or like American Werewolf in London, like you're slowly, deforming yourself and becoming the monster of the neckbeard that you feared. And I thought that like it kind of helped to not have the line breaks and to have it feel as if you're reading a story, and then secretly you're kind of discovering that you're actually still quite in a poem. If that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the last line, or I mean, there's again, it's sort of the last like verbal phrase, because obviously the lines, there's not really lines, and then there's also like the sentences are incredibly long, but this part at the end, oh your God, your own sorry, I don't have it in front of me, your own growing facial hair, which oh your God, you can't see. I'm really interested in that moment where instead of saying oh my God, it's suddenly oh your God, almost as if at the very end the speaker is alienated from himself and is seeing, oh your God, it begins with you in a very casual way, and we're not really noticing that it's written in second person all the way through.
Right.
We're addressing this.
It begins with a generic you. Yeah.
Yes, and then at the very end, you're calling our attention to that device, and I think it's really interesting because it does kind of exactly what you said. In a way, it's like replacing. It's sort of switching the positions of the neckbeard, who at the beginning is kind of this distanced thing, and then the you, which is ostensibly an inner monologue. By the end, oh, your God is almost like we're almost alienated from the person we began with and getting close to the person that we were far away from at the beginning.
Right, and I think that's sort of taking things to their logical conclusion. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
are sincere about your belief that the poem can bridge the distance between the writer and the subject,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it sort of follows logically that there's no reason that you wouldn't be able to similarly eliminate that distance between reader and author.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's like if there's no wall between me and the neckbeard, there's also no wall between you, the reader, and the neckbeard, or you, the reader, and me. That kind of intimacy is omnidirectional. You know,
Okay, yeah.
If it's a real poem, quote unquote.
Yeah. Let's talk about
yeah.
the reader, actually. I think that's a good moment to jump off. Because I think we're starting to do these little online workshops. And hopefully you and I will get a chance to workshop some stuff as well later and give some feedback. But what role do you think the reader or the audience plays in a work of writing? Like, what are they doing? And as a writer, what are you thinking about in terms of your readers or in terms of your audience?
Oof, a very simple and a very complicated question at the same time. I mean, I'm not an absolutist, and I think most people aren't. You know, like there's some people that might stake out a claim as like a literary critic that they have one particular ideology, that all the meaning is in the text, or all the meaning is authorial intent, or all the meaning comes from the subject. I think it's always a mix. You know, and like I kind of think of it in like a probabilistic sense, or like a almost like a quantum superposition. Like there are many possible meanings that exist within a text, and that meaning is the range of meanings is maybe prescribed by the text itself and prescribed by the act of the author. But ultimately, it's chosen and decided upon by the reader. And I'm sorry if I'm getting in some really abstract like metaphysics metaphors, you know. But like if you've heard of like the thought experiment of like Schrodinger's cat, right? Like you have a cat inside a box, and if you open the box, it releases a poison canister that then kills the cat. But until you open the box, the cat is either dead or not dead. And I think Schrodinger originally designed this thought experiment to disprove the idea that something could be both dead and not dead at the same time. But like I kind of think that that's kind of how the poem is, right? There is going to be 1 in 100 readers that is unable to recognize that the cat is dead, and you have to accept that. But whoever built the box also clearly has designed it in such a way that 99 times out of 100, it'll be very clear the cat's gone. So like authorial responsibility just is somewhat there, but fundamentally, you don't have final say in what people get out of the work and whether or not they enjoy it, and you have to be aware of that. And you know, politically speaking, I mean, this is like at the point if you ever become famous, which thankfully I'm not, but like you do have to be careful about what you put out into the world and what effect it might have if you know who your audience is, you know, which is kind of a weird thing because most of us when we're writing, especially like early writing, you have no idea about any imagined audience. You don't know who's reading your stuff, your shit. If you have a workshop group, it's great. It's your friends and family. But like I even then faced issues like that. Like I remember I was writing a funny poem, like where I liked the idea of taking a comedic rant and sort of really pushing it as sort of a thought experiment. And I directed it at somebody else in my workshop group sort of as a joke, where like between when I read it to him personally, he was laughing out loud, it was great, but almost took on a different energy when I read it to the entire workshop group because not all of them were in on the joke, right? And like I'm literally just saying like, fuck you, Dan Brown. Like Dan Brown was his name. He's not the famous Dan Brown. It's just a guy named Dan Brown. But, the people that didn't get it, all of a sudden they were horrified. Whereas, and he was still laughing his ass off. And once they saw him, it was okay. But like that sort of thing, you'll notice sometimes. Or I've had a poem that was sort of deeply political in nature. Specifically about my experience getting mugged in Detroit, called "What It's Like to Be a White Guy with a Black Eye in Detroit." For those who don't know, now Detroit City, for those of you who are not aware of the demographics, because it's not always clear, is different than most American cities in that it's 85% Black, and so the experience of race there is fundamentally fairly distinct from in the college town where I grew up, Ann Arbor, which is about 65% white, which is a little bit closer to like what the average town in America is. England, I'm sure, it's probably a big difference between whether you're in London or outside. But the point is, I would read this poem in Detroit, and a lot of these scenes, which involve graphic violence to me, and sort of how you become like racially noticed in a way that you wouldn't otherwise be as a white person who's a victim of violence. It was very funny to all of the Black audiences. I would consistently get laughter. Whereas when I would perform it in front of the mostly white audience in Ann Arbor, in a town that was for the most part free of violence and also for the most part white, right? Because even though it's 65% white, the remaining 30% aren't majority Black. It's actually majority immigrants from a variety of different countries, but mostly Southeast Asian. So they had not the same sort of life experience context, and they were so horrified by the violence in the piece that they had no room to laugh. It wasn't relatable to them, and it was to people who had actually grown up and potentially been mugged or knew people who got mugged, and who, for whom that event, while difficult, is not by any means the end of the world.
And that's
sorry,
really,
I'm like taking a long
no,
walk.
That's really interesting. And that's really helpful to think about, almost like the one poem becomes two different things depending on the context, or it can be serious or funny or whatever, depending on how you yourself situate yourself in the poem as a reader or as a listener. And I think that's really interesting. And so I guess it seems like a good piece of writing, then, if I can hazard a thought, is potentially something that involves having kind of multiple ways to situate yourself within it, or potentially room to situate yourself within it in some way to kind of be able to enter the space of the writing, maybe is one important thing that a piece of writing that's good does.
Yeah, I mean, that's an obsession that I personally had, because I wasn't someone who came from like a background of being hyper into classic literary poetry. I couldn't get into Shakespeare. I couldn't get into the poetry I was being taught at school. So I, for where I came from, I felt like accessibility was a big issue. And that's something that I've changed on a lot as I've grown older as a writer, and I've been more interested in writing things that are maybe a little bit more weird and hard to get into. But I do think that, what you're talking about, like being able to relate to the poem, like you do need to think about, are you writing in a way that an outside reader is going to be able to understand? And sometimes it's even just like, is the metaphor that I'm constructing, is it one step deep or is it 3 steps deep? Because people don't know to read a 3-step deep metaphor. Like maybe like graduate students in English, if they know that the writer is famous for something like this, they'll look for it. And if you have like a scene that like specifically prizes esoteric writing, go for it. But I do think there's a thing where a lot of people will write something where it's like their metaphors are so convoluted that like I have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. And that's a quick way to turn off a reader.
But I think, what I think is interesting about your work, like this moment of "Oh, you're God, for example, at the end of definition of poetry, is on the surface, it's really easy to kind of understand what's going on. And yet the formal turn that you're using is essentially calling our attention to this second person, which I think is quite complex. And so I think maybe there's a way to have a kind of formal difficulty without turning off a reader as well.
Yeah. Well, like some of it's like I don't think it's possible to keep in mind all of the things that a poem happens to be doing to you or with you simultaneously, right? Like I'm not necessarily assuming that someone's going to read that poem for the first time and automatically get the concept that like they are no better than the neckbeards, um, having read that, or that like the poem is designed to make them on the same level of the neckbeard. Like it's purely enough of the emotional experience for them as to like laugh at this notion that like now they're growing a neckbeard. You know, it's if you only
Mm.
get it on the one level, fine. Like if you can get it on multiple levels, great. But like, yeah, I'm totally satisfied if someone just gets through it and thinks it's fucking hilarious and moves on with their life. Like it, yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, let's move on a little bit. And let's look at some specific poems. I'm open. Do you feel like doing the guy who broke into my car thing, or do you want to go straight to the de-overdose poem, or what do you think about that? I'm
It's
open
up to you.
to timing. We're easy. Um,
Should we
yeah,
save the funny parts for last or the sad parts for last?
yeah, always start on a yeah, okay, let's do the de-overdose poem first, I guess. Let's do that and then we can do the other poem.
Yeah.
So let me see if I can pull that
Show your readers
up.
that I'm not, or so show your students that I'm not just someone who writes dick jokes.
Yeah. Okay, let's see if I can. All right, brilliant. So I can bring it up on my screen, but I can't see you at the same time, but I hope that's
That's okay. Do you want me to do a reading or?
Yeah, you'll do a reading and I'm going to post this online. So for those of you who want to see the text, and I think it's really important, I'm going to flag this up. I think with Gahl's work, while he's an able reader, I think there's a lot going on, and we can talk about this later, but I know that Gahl puts a lot of energy and effort into thinking about things like line breaks and the work functions on the page. So for those of you who are watching this, please do look at it and read it and see what's going on, because I think you'll miss out on a lot if you don't read it.
Yeah. Funny
Yeah.
side note: in the original Neckbeard's poem, I was going to line break specifically the lines, "Oh, your God, you know you can't see," to try and get the enjambment of being like, "You can't see God," you know. But then I was like, "Nah, it's still
Oh,
hilarious." We don't need to go that
excellent.
deep into the wanking off woods.
Okay. All right, great. Okay.
All right.
So whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Should I introduce this poem or just read it?
You're welcome to introduce it if you want to.
Uh, yeah. We'll
Actually,
talk about that
maybe.
afterwards. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll let it
Let's
stand
just
on its own.
let's just have it completely fresh.
Okay. This is called De-Overdose after Roger Robinson. His heart beats. The doctors take their hands off his heart, release the forceps, close the rib spreader, and with it, his ribs. Draw a scalpel across his chest. His fever drops. I mutter, die him, let don't. Breathe calmer. Return from the bathroom to Jessica's dorm, where I sit down and they're watching Dexter. I look at my phone, read the words one by one. Critical. Dropped. Stats. His blood pressure and breathing rise. Stabilize. He breathes above the respirator, but barely. A day passes. I'm there, whispering, "You love, I know you." Letting go of his hands, weighing options. How much time do I have left? I sit back down. The doctors come in and tell me they can't take him out of the coma yet. He's not breathing out of the respirator. I go back to reading the same webcomic from strip 1800 back to 1, taking breaks to eat, to sleep, to email professors how I may have to miss class. Maggie gets more scared. There's an inrush of fluids from the external bladder into his abdomen. The nurse gets worried, checks back 3, 4 times as his stomach deflates. Maggie cries, I read comics, his parents tell me he doesn't have to go to business school anymore, as if he's about to go somewhere. The doctors come in to explain how they put him in a coma so the drugs won't burn out his brain. Syndrome serotonin, they say, as a confused look worms its way off my face. The sun goes back down. I drive back to my house, take off my clothes, open my phone to talk to Maggie. She explains what happened. I ask her why she's calling, hang up, look at the phone, 3:43 a.m., lie down as it buzzes and beeps. Spencer rides to his apartment in the ambulance while the EMTs take the IVs out of him and erase vitals before confirming them on his body. He opens his eyes for the last time and looks at Maggie, whose hand he's holding, tells her she's the most beautiful girl in the world, asks where his parents are, says whatever other stupid thing you say when he pulled the ripcord to your brain. The ambulance reaches the house and they roll him back into his room, let him out, leave. He sits on the couch while she tries to keep him awake, puts her hands in his hair, panics, hugs him, and eventually rushes out the front door as he stares into the distance. He waits, leaves for the bathroom, pulls the flusher, watches the vomit come up from the bowl, waves his hand over the bowl like a magician while toilet paper emerges nearly dry, which he uses to wipe a little bit of bile onto his lip and chin, his beard, before bringing it under a sink where the paper, now clean, dries completely. He untears it from the roll, then bows over the bowl, dawdling a moment before he sucks up the contents. At first, a few stringy drops of spit, and then a small torrent, speckled with little red and blue pellets. He stoppers it in his throat with an index finger and looks quizzically at the toilet bowl, while Maggie at her house tells the dispatcher his address. She finishes just in time to pick up his call, hear him agree, tell him what to do. You tell her he doesn't know. All of them. And she asks him how many pills. And he tells her he's taken all his pills, apologizes, and she says, any more me call to get don't you. Stone-faced. He says her name like the most important question, closes the phone, forgets what it all means, unswallows Wellbutrin and Abilify capsules one by one, two by two, winces, shivers, smiles bitterly until the bottles are full again. He sits down in front of his laptop to empty it of a nonsensical note where he asks his family first to make a museum out of his belongings and publish his writing, and second, to burn it all. Miles away, as he erases his goodbye to the world, I wake up, open my computer, delete my homework, close the computer, and pick up my phone and pace with it. Tomorrow, I say. Work got I, besides and. Wait, can he, I say. Yeah. I curse. Weigh options. Get angry, it's the third time. Count the times down in my head. I flip open my phone and reassure Maggie I'll handle it. She explains through sobs how Spencer just called her, how he wouldn't explain why or what happened, just said he's breaking up with her, with everybody.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gahl. That's such an interesting and moving poem. Did you want to talk about it a little bit first before I kind of jump in with questions, or?
I mean, I guess just a side note for all of you college students, because this was written during, I mean, not during, but it's relating to a time when I was a university student where one of my mentally ill friends did take their own life. So if any of you are in a place where you feel like you need help and are having serious thoughts about hurting yourself, especially if you have found yourself making plans, please get help. Please get help. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Now we can talk about the poem.
Okay, cool. Let's start with the title. So the title is De-Overdose. And does that come from, so I know you said you modeled it after a poem by Roger Robinson.
Yes.
Do you want to kind of talk a little bit about that and kind of what the structure of that is and why you chose to do that?
Yeah. So Roger Robinson is a UK poet. I think he's ethnically Trinidadian, but like born in London. He's a spoken word poet, a dub poet, I think is the name of the
Mm-hmm.
sort of sub school he's a part of. And I was exposed to a poem of his. I think it was called Undrowning, actually.
Okay.
Uh, but I'm not totally sure. But the poem itself was detailing the story of a drowning that happens in reverse. I believe of his brother, if I'm not mistaken. But it was told in sort of a narrative form and entirely in tercets. Um, and I was sort of given this poem as part of my graduate school coursework. And I think we were given sort of a prompt at the time to um, like write, I think it was letters to abstractions or to things that were difficult in our lives. This was an example of using spoken word, but as we would in the school setting of like helping the kids write like "Dear Grief" or "Dear Addiction" kind of thing. To use these sort of poems to find out which kids might need specific social services. For me at the time, though, I was kind of fixated on the structure that I had seen of telling the idea of a death in reverse.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one that weighed on my mind in particular because, and this is not necessarily unique to people who have friends that have committed suicide, but you start sort of doing a kind of like autopsy yourself of the moments leading up to it to see if there's a way to fix it or a place where you could have made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And in that particular case, there was a lot of guilt, right? Because I had been approached directly by his fiance, this is one of my best friends, to call him, right? I didn't know at the time that he had uh, been suicidal for a while, and that this was a friend of ours who had bipolar disorder, and his struggles with mental health kind of came and went. So I thought he was, had been lucid and been on his meds, but apparently he was having more frequent swings and just wasn't telling anyone. Um, so there was a lot of guilt that I was sort of dealing with for years after, including when that poem was written, about feeling as if like if I had called him that night, maybe I would have been able to talk him down from that sort of thing. You know, which is on the one hand a little bit narcissistic, but on the other hand, I think it's a kind of a natural response that we all have when something like that happens, because you want to feel as if that there's a way to stop it, that you have control over it. And because if you can take control of that, then you can cope with it more easily. And so, like, I noticed that in the Roger Robinson poem, because it also sort of comes back to that. And when I found that parallel, I was like, oh, this might be a good way for me to get that out. And it's not the first poem that I had tried to write about this exact sort of issue. But I did find that by putting it in reverse and by putting it as a narrative where I didn't do any editorializing, it made it sort of a lot clearer where the feeling of guilt lies, just by sticking it at the end the way that it does by having a reverse narrative. And then also, it doesn't, I don't know, it felt in a way like less melodramatic and you might otherwise have, because it's hard to not feel like you're being melodramatic when you're talking about something that's literally life and death. And I think like that's a problem you run into as a writer, because like we all are going to suffer some kind of tragedy in the course of our lives. Just because like that's a part of life, being assaulted, having people you love die, sickness, terminal illness, these types of things. It's like, it's just a natural part of the lifespan. So like we all have to deal with these things, but it's very hard to address them in a way that doesn't feel like it's cloying or going to be sentimental, because that's most of the art that we see in the mainstream. So this is one of those nice ways where it's like a poem that you could find as a model, like the one I found with Roger Robinson, was really nice, right? Because it was at enough of a distance that I didn't feel like I was being manipulated into feeling away, but it was still giving the information and leaving that space that I could make that connection, right? Like I don't think Roger Robinson necessarily wrote that so that other people who have had people who, friends and family that have committed suicide can necessarily make that direct connection. He probably was doing it for his own reasons. But this is coming back to sort of what you were talking about earlier, with like how readers bring meaning. That's the meaning that I was able to sort of find a connection with it, and it then made it easier for me to sort of forgive myself and move on.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. In terms of thinking about literary models, I want to focus on this reverse question. And of course the whole story here is being told in reverse. Which we only realize, we start to realize that at some point. I think it's easier to realize, I will have to say, I think when you're reading it out loud, I tried to think about when I would sort of clock that it was in reverse, and I would say it happens later, maybe hearing you read it versus seeing it on the page. I think once you start to see the words, the text messages and stuff backwards, it's very easy to kind of start being like, oh, okay, things are happening in reverse. It takes a little longer. But either way, I got it both times. But I want to talk about that because it sort of formally is grappling with one of the obvious questions when you're writing about a death, which is to say, we know that the person died. And you kind of actually, there's no kind of dramatic tension if you know that someone is already dead. If you kind of have that as the end point, there's really almost nowhere to go as a writer. So in a way, you're starting with the kind of end point at which there's kind of really nothing more to say, and kind of pulling backwards from that in this narrative. Would you say that that's fair, or do you think there's something else that's going on as to what the reversal is doing? I mean, I know you talked about kind of the personal factors, but maybe there's something else formally that's going on about being able to narrate a death more easily this way, or...
Sure. I mean, I'm going to be beating a dead horse here. So I'm sorry for repeating myself. And this is something that is apparent to me as the writer of the piece, so it might not show up for a reader at all. But I think when you're dealing with a death in reverse, it's inherently a question of culpability, right? And that makes it
like what happened to cause this?
Yeah, so there is a question of suspense, but it's the suspense of a mystery novel, right? It's a whodunit. And that's also like why it simultaneously is a relief of tension, but also kind of a thudding thing when you recognize shortly after reading the poem, like, oh, like you were the one who dropped the ball, quote unquote.
Okay. Yeah. So there's this moment in there where the speaker is like, yeah, or wait, so tomorrow I say work got I besides, and wait, can he? I say, yeah. And so there's this, and then the scene of that's kind of, we at that point we know what happens as a result, part of all those little decisions.
Yeah, if you're someone who's invested in translating it backwards, then you're saying, yeah, what I actually said is, yeah, he can wait, and besides, I got work tomorrow. So call him tomorrow. Like, this is me telling myself what happens before I go to bed, right? And then by turning it around, we get this thing where I think it's kind of interesting for me because I was worried about using that technique a little bit too excessively, partially because it gets confusing for the reader. But I think there's also a value in it in that by forcing them to do that cognitive work of flipping the word around in their head to understand what's going on, that is a little bit of puzzle solving that actually puts you at a distance from the emotions of what might actually be happening.
Yeah.
Right? Which is really important, like in the beginning, for example, in the first utterance that we have that's backwards, right? I mutter, die him, let don't. If I actually had the words don't let him die in there, it would be
very melodramatic.
Yeah, and very cloying, even though it is what I literally said.
Right.
So by putting it backwards and having it be the point at which like it becomes immediately clear this is happening in reverse.
Right.
We are given the setting and the scenario all at once, and then are also, immediately having our attention sort of pulled away from what would be melodramatic and instead starts to become more functional and gets almost a more methodical feeling to it.
Okay. I want to dwell on that for a minute because I think that's really fascinating. And I think that there's an interesting tension in this piece that has nothing to do with the topic, but has to do with actually technology, which is to say, I feel like there's something that's really interesting about the idea of playing something in reverse that is so clearly an artifact of modernity. This is like my moment as being like a literary critic person as well. No, but I think it's really interesting because this poem and this technique in general of doing an event in reverse is so clearly reliant on having the experience of watching film and TV and being able to fast forward and reverse it. That's just kind of gotten into our culture. And yet at the same time, there's things that you're able to do with it because it's a piece of writing that are way more interesting than if we were compelled to watch it as a film. So I think this is actually an a moment where writing can do something that like a film like Memento or something like that cannot, because of the words going in reverse, and this moment where you can kind of pause and like puzzle it out, and there's like a bit more of the ability to kind of go in and out of the characters. There's something there that isn't purely an image. I mean, obviously there are some vivid images in this, but there's also something else. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
To the connection between technology and writing, or
just to the question about like reversing or fast forwarding.
yeah, I mean, there's always the relationship with time that we don't think about as a writer, technically speaking, but it is a thing where because poems are not confined to the same limits as traditional narrative. Although you could do this with more experimental prose, and I've seen it done very well. But especially with literature, more than with other mediums. So with writing specifically, you have the capacity to do things like take an instant and stretch it out for a page, or you can have, a single sentence encapsulate 15 years, right? Or as we often see in books, they'll have like 3 asterisks, and then all of a sudden it'll be 7 years later in a different continent, right? So I think there's definitely something there. This particular poem is very specific about its time frame, and then it lasts, I think, exactly 11 days. 9 days of coma, and then 10 days. 9 days of coma and the 1 day prior. And like it ends on the exact phone call that Spencer makes, the sort of last phone call that he makes before he takes the pills. Which, I mean, this is another thing where, like, speaking as a writer in process, this is one of the things that made it useful and better for me than other pieces. Because the previous times that I tried to write the same poem, I kind of ended with my own feeling of guilt or my own feeling of responsibility, having made the decision not to do anything. But when I was writing in reverse here, visually, and like this will be sort of obvious if the people that are listening to this can see the poem, those things that I'm saying to myself end at the beginning of a line, right? And that is not a place where you can actually end a poem. And sort of searching for that poem, I had to keep writing backwards. And what I eventually stopped on is Spencer's choice, which is ultimately, the most important one, since he's the one that killed himself.
Right.
So I think it's kind of that editing process that normally we're doing just looking draft by draft is happening a little bit more plainly when the whole poem itself is something that is created through this artifice of writing in reverse or writing in a time frame that's completely unnatural. But it might be a good way to let you break out of your previous habit. So if you're having trouble with writing a poem, try writing it in reverse, or try writing it instead of the whole of the moment, write the moment after that, what you're trying to write about just happened. I found that to be very fruitful for me for times where I'm feeling sort of creatively stuck.
Okay, great. I've shared some stuff on the ELE page about writing past, or writing, if you normally write to a 10-minute timer, then write to minute 11 just to see what happens. And I think I'll say one more thing and then maybe we can move on, which is just, do you think that something else about being forced to write to this form, I mean, it's obviously a loose form, but like the quatrains was also something that kind of encouraged you to keep writing past just yourself and making it more of like, okay, I'm going to write something that's actually going to kind of move away from just a sort of self-indulgent guilt moment and get into something that really draws the whole picture a little better, because you kind of have to work to, okay, I've got this form set for me, these 4 lines, and I've kind of got to keep writing 4 lines regardless of whether I want to say more.
Yeah, sometimes. In this particular case, not so much. I was, just speaking to the truth of the matter, I was trying to imitate his tercet style. And I just found that my tercets were exceedingly long, and like they didn't, more importantly, more to the point, they didn't connect narratively with singular moments or singular images. Whereas when I wrote in quatrain, when I rebroke it and sort of made it into quatrains, I was able to make the lines manageable rather than like wrapping around, and it also felt like they were either located in a position in time or a position in space that felt like one chunk. Which is not like, it's not a hard and fast rule, but I think that good line breaking and good paragraph breaking for fiction and nonfiction is a lot like movie editing. Like there's a certain natural rhythm that you want to have. That if you ever do like film studies, your students, you'll learn that like when editors are doing it, they want to have the cuts in the film sort of correlate with the same frequency with which people normally blink, because that'll make a more natural viewing experience. So I think it's like 1 to 7 seconds. Usually there's a cut, even in a static scene, unless it's like specifically a choice by the director to have a long take. They'll do that because there's a natural rhythm in which we sort of take in that information, and it makes it more digestible. And I think that sort of digestibility is really important for good writing, for poetry, for prose. If I can go on a complete sideways tangent for a half second.
Yeah, of course.
One of my favorite like books from a technical perspective is George R. R. Martin's A Game of Thrones. You know, the fantasy, and I'm not a big fantasy reader at all. I think I read the Harry Potter series when I was young, and that's pretty much it. Like I didn't, after the YA years, I left it alone. And Game of Thrones, specifically the first one, A Game of Thrones, I remember reading it and being incredibly excited that every one of these chapters, besides revolving around different characters, they were so digestible. Like it was exactly 6 to 8 pages for every chapter, which felt like the right length. And I felt that there was exactly a certain amount of advancement happening in the narrative, a certain amount of new characters being introduced, a certain amount of setting the backstory, but it was all very balanced. And there's that same sort of feeling of like good cuts in a movie or good line breaks in a poem where you felt like comfortable stopping and your brain could sort of really digest exactly what you had at that piece, and it felt like secure.
That's really interesting. Yeah. One more thing, maybe I realized I was just going to say, like, let's stop talking about it. One more thing occurred to me looking at this on the page. Sure. Again, about the temporality of it. I mean, I know you said it stretches over like a certain number of days, like quite a few days. But again, those kind of longer periods, you know, there's something about the way the temporality takes place on the page where actually we're spending more time on certain moments than others. So could you talk a little bit about pacing? I know that's important for people who are writing stories and so on. You know, how absolutely. To compress a narrative, or what, you know, what points, beats, you know, to focus on and so on. Because this is, it's also a very narrative work, I have to say. Like this is, obviously it's composed as a poem, but just like with the definition of poetry, it's also doing a ton of narrative work, and it is functionally also a story.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'd love to go through it. I'll go through it technically pretty quickly. But yeah, for me, it was like focusing on the moment specifically. There's only 2 reasons that I think you would want to focus on the moment from a narrative perspective. The first one is if, you know, there's plot advancement and character development. And the second, which we don't really cover in this particular piece, but you might in other ones, is going to be what we call B matter, or things that are expository in nature specifically for the audience. That's sort of the distinction that I use for story writing specifically, of A matter and B matter. So if we look at this poem just to start off with, stanza 1 is the moment of him dying, and almost all of it is descriptive language about what happens in the moment that his heart stops, but backwards again, right? So first we begin with the heart beating, the first beat or the last beat, however you want to think about that. The doctors doing the last things that they do to try and resuscitate his heart. Right? And then we are transitioning. I forcefully broke the line that I have, this sort of final line of me muttering under my breath while I'm hearing him going into cardiac arrest. I broke it in half to force them into the second stanza. Right? And in real life, I don't know if his heart stopped exactly the time that I was getting the text from Maggie from the hospital saying that the stats had dropped, right? Like this is a narrative conceit. You know, maybe he died 7 minutes later, maybe he didn't, but we're placing it back to back. Then again, he comes from that moment of death. In the third stanza, he comes back to being stabilized. In the fourth stanza, you know, we have located me back at the hospital, being given the bad news. This was in the original like real life narrative. His breathing was becoming better and actually breathing above the respirator. We were very hopeful, and then it got worse. And they were saying, well, we can't take him off yet. He's not breathing above the respirator, but you know his temperature has gone down. But there was like a minor crisis where there's an inrush of fluids, Then his stomach deflated. We thought everything was out of the woods. I left. Then his fever shot back up. In particular, in his case, he had overdosed on mood stabilizers. So it's not even sure if this was an actual suicide attempt or if he was just having a psychotic episode. But he was using, sorry to get really technical, he was using antidepressants. And so when you overdose on antidepressants, your brain goes into an acute fever, and that's usually what causes your heart to stop and you to die. So sort of tracking that fever. We go in the fourth stanza to the fever removing and his sort of brain activity and breath going down. Then we go back. I'm sending emails to my professor because we're now worried about the fluids in his abdomen, about him being overactive. Then we going back another stanza. That's the exact moment that his parents have now revealed to me, like in sort of their bargain with God, that if he comes back to health,
he doesn't have to go to business
school. Yeah.
And that's a really interesting moment because we get these characters in that one moment that we don't get anywhere else in the poem. And I actually think that's really interesting. And again, like I'm going to try to bring it away from the autobiographical because obviously you as the writer know this, but I think it functions as a piece regardless of whether we see it as being informed by your life or not. I mean, and as a reader, we don't know that. But just like the characters of the parents from that line are so well described and interesting, kind of both how kind of we understand so much about their interests basically in that moment. And I know obviously you're probably thinking about real people when you're saying that, but in the piece, there's a really interesting moment there, I think.
Well, and to bring it back to this question of pacing, each of these things is physically important under the assumption that he'd still be alive, right? If he was alive, that would be narratively important to him. But in terms of physical time, those stanzas are happening on different days. There's one day in which he has the crisis of his stomach inflating. There's a separate day in which the parents have arrived at the hospital from, like, I think they were, not physically present, so they're physically arriving and then, coming to terms with what's happened. And then, 2 days later is when his vitals have stabilized and I finally leave, only to find out what happens. So it's like, while we're skipping from moment to moment, there's sometimes half a day and sometimes as much as like 3 or 4 days between each of those stanzas.
Right.
And I guess the physical reality matters less than the story beats, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, right. Because we don't have then it was 3 days later. Then the next day, like this kind of unnecessary sense of temporality that isn't really telling us anything. It's kind of giving us the events.
Yeah, which, I mean, you might want to do that if you're trying to tell a traditional, prose story, but you don't necessarily have to. I mean, that would be a case where it might be effective to just do, the 3 asterisks we talked about before and then just cut to a new scene.
Mm-hmm.
Or, days pass and then cut to a new scene. Like, it's not something where you necessarily have to keep the same amount of focus across the timeline.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then really this entire second half is that first day. So we've got quite a long, which I think works. I mean, I think the thing I don't need to tell you that your poem works, but I think, one of the things that becomes clear is that part of the reason that the time is condensed at the beginning and longer at the end is because it's a story of Spencer. And so the more he is able to be present and kind of literally alive as a character, are the moments when we get a more expanded and sort of slowed down temporality. Whereas when it's kind of this coma, we get some time passing, but maybe not quite as much of a focus on that. And it seems to me as if it's clear that the form was able to kind of torque you into kind of exactly what you were saying earlier with the neckbeard situation, like stepping out of yourself as a character or as a focus, even if that's like incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and you'll notice that from a narration perspective, I hate to use the word narration so many times, but I mean literally in terms of this is a third person, but it's not a third person for me. every character that is not Spencer, we only hear what they do. We don't hear
Right.
what they think or feel.
Right.
Um,
And I think that's very important in terms of like dealing with these difficult kind of topics as well.
yeah, the only person that we have some sort of speculation as to what his mood state is or how he's making decisions is Spencer himself, which is why he ends up taking up so much more space in the poem, which I think
Right.
it should, because obviously he's the main character here.
Right. Right. Excellent. Okay. Great. Okay, that was a lot. Thank you so much for that. No, that's good. I mean, we can take long. This is usually like a half hour. Sorry, a half hour. It's usually 3 hours the sessions that we have with the students. So I don't think it's a problem to go long with this interview. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm not going to go for 3 hours, but maybe will we talk about? Do you want to talk about? Do you have energy to talk about the Larry poem, the car?
Yeah, maybe let's make this a point where if you're taking this class remotely, grab yourself some snacks, buddy. The hard part's over. Everything from now is going to be mostly funny, I think. I don't know. But like we'll do this chop thing, and then like I'm going to do a chop back. And now, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great time. Stretch your legs. Did whatever you had to do. Smoked a blunt.
Not legal in this country.
Oh, I mean,
Jewel pod CBD oil.
Yeah.
Or I don't know if that's good. Actually, we shouldn't be at this point with the coronavirus. We should not be advising any of that.
But, no, I don't advise any of that stuff. I actually don't smoke myself. Played video games, really. That's or like masturbated, just like really boring stuff is what I'm into. Don't do both at the same time, though. That's dangerous. Anyways, we're talking about a much sillier piece now. Do you want to? I don't know what you wanted to say.
Okay, yeah, let's no, I think it's good. We're going to it's really nice to have this opportunity because it allows us to get to know you as a writer a little more, which is interesting. Like I brought in a few different pieces of work, but I think this will be the first time that we're looking at one person's writing like more than one or two pieces. So let me see if I can find it from you. Oh yeah, here we go. It's the open letter to the man who broke into my car.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And whenever you're ready, I'm ready.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, I guess I'm going to do a reading of it, right?
Yeah, if you want to.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's great to do a reading. And I know this is long, so.
No, it's fine.
But yeah, it should be good.
Oh yeah, sorry. Warning for all of you people who are reading. I think this is a longer piece, more along the lines of definition of poetry length. It's going to be a trip. So, here we go. Open letter to the man who broke into my car. Again. Let's assume, if you're reading this, you must have done it again. It's not so crazy. My car has been broken into 3 times, 2 of those times being the consecutive past 2 days. So let's assume it's the same guy. Let's assume it's a guy. And that guy is you. And your name is Larry. And that you're white. And probably a drunk. And that you have some dumb barfly nickname like Potsy or Shooter or Birdman, and are definitely past your prime. I mean, sure, it's Logan Square we're talking about, so theoretically you could be Chicano or Black or Boricua, but come on, how did I get here? Who lives in my building? Across the street? Who owns the record store next to my broken-in car that sells actual vinyl records and has a vintage nickel arcade in the back and hosts indie music shows where nobody dances? Also, Larry, who breaks into the passenger side door of a parked 2004 Honda Accord coupe with a rusting dent consuming the rear passenger side quarter panel rust that is clearly visible alongside the 2-foot-long scratches, rust that broadcasts just how the finish has chipped off of the body. You can't just ignore that. Just like I can't ignore the fact that the door was unlocked. Yes, I'm both aware and not hiding it. The automatic locks broke this winter, and I haven't fixed them because money. I'm joking, but it's also very not a joke. Also, I've not the time. In real talk, I won't even have this car in 3 months' time, so whatever, dude, I'll grant you, broke into is arguably too strong a term, at the very least a sensationalistic start. I'm not a total jagoff. But it's also not like I didn't notice that you left the car a mess each time. The insurance paperwork thrown about, the glove compartment emptied, registration maybe stolen, and again, I know how it sounds to not know if your own registration was stolen or not, but also I had to change the plates twice when I changed insurance. And frankly, re-updating the city stickers and registration costs, again, money. And I know I didn't pay for a new city sticker because nobody would notice that the plate numbers didn't match. And the old registration does still match the VIN. And I still have the title. And if you still want to call me irresponsible, Larry, you can. But know, too, that I keep the passenger side door locked, usually. I only unlock it on those rare occasions where I have company. So far, on 2 out of the 3 break-ins, because that one woman that loves me came to visit. And dear Larry, you know how that feels. To have somebody out there love you so much, you'd unlock every door you hold keys to just on the chance she might open one, but also so gone. You want to hold on to whatever you can that reminds you that you aren't always alone in a hoopty with mismatched registration and plates and an oxidizing dent the size of a restaurant bus tub in the passenger side quarter panel behind the door with a lock that doesn't work. And by familiarity alone, it should be obvious what is clearly a smattering of unpaid parking tickets in the back seat next to a literal trash bag of literal trash. Larry, you can make an educated guess why I hadn't gotten around to taking that out, but can I ask you why you would choose to keep coming back at what must be about 4 a.m., since it happened to be at least a half hour after the record store, music venue, and the bar across the street both had closed, but before those old guys who run the Polish Pigeon Racing Cooperative next door come to train their pigeons, why you'd wait until 4 a.m. to go and make a mess in my already pockmarked and garbage ulcerated rust bucket a third time, knowing all about it. I mean, my old tax returns are in there, pal. You can see exactly how much I'm not making. You can tell from the PT receipts and prescription slips that I've got a virulent and contagious strain of pink eye and a bum elbow I've yet to do anything about. You know that at best, all I ever had in that car was roughly $2 in change for the meter, and you stole it all the night before. So why even work so hard? I get checking the trunk. I do. But why open my CD cases? I mean, even if they weren't all burned CDRs from the MySpace era, you know they would still have no resale value. That there's what ruffles my feathers, Birdman. Even when I fantasize about catching you in the act and hitting you with a crowbar or a tire iron, I'm still not fully into it. Even in my dreams, I don't go for the skull or the knees. I don't imagine you bone broken or even bloody from the half dozen dull whacks I'd lay into your back. At best, in my heart of hearts, it's some raised welts, maybe a little bruising. And you know why, Patsy? It's because you and me, we're the same. And Potts, I don't mean that in the sense of bono me or turn the other cheek or we're all one human family. I'm also not saying I myself drink too much or have bathed in a gas station sink or used to run a small-time hustle in the late 80s involving fireproof furniture. I haven't. What I mean is, Lawrence, it's a moot point. There's nowhere lower to fall into. Maybe I could get all riled up and think about knife fights or dramatic confrontations, but come on. Who am I really to be doing all that? And who are you to do it all on account of? You've made less on your little personalized crime spree than the bums out on Fullerton can spange at the entrance to I-94 in an hour when it's the sun showing out. You can go ahead and ask them if you don't believe me. It's only 2 blocks up from here. One of them is literally a guy I literally went to high school with. He sleeps on a mattress under the overpass now. Name of John. We don't talk anymore, me and him. You know, different lanes, what have you. They called him Stinky Pete back in the day, some kind of joke. He got kicked out of school sophomore year, and the next year he came back in one day and passed out in the bathroom on an OD. You know what happened? he had to call an ambulance, which is maybe why he came back in the first place. You know, he knew we'd do right by him. But Larry, here's the thing. That was the first and last time. He never showed up at our school again. And it wasn't shame. He wasn't banned. It wasn't even like he didn't have buddies there anymore. It was just, he was in some kind of way. And after a certain point, there's nothing more you can do, you know? What he needed, we didn't have to give.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Okay, excellent. I was really absorbed in that reading. Sorry, I'm just gonna kind of like rejoin reality now. Okay. This is a really interesting poem. I think again we're starting to get a sense, hopefully by now, students will be able to get a sense of your style.
Mm.
I think this has like things that I would identify that we've talked about before. It's a strong kind of narrative structure. It's kind of both very clearly a poem, but also the kind of length and shape that you could, in theory, turn it into a story or consider it to be a kind of fiction. I mean, it definitely makes a lot of fictional moves alongside being a poem. And I think I'll dwell on the other key aspect that I think we've kind of brought out, which is this question about empathy or intimacy with fictional characters. And so one of the reasons I think that this could also potentially be analyzed as a story is that you're basically generating out of whole cloth this character of the guy that's been breaking into the car and kind of developing like a whole relationship with him, to the point at which, like, at the end, you're like telling him these like philosophical stories. You're calling him by his name that you've generated completely from whole cloth. And you're developing this. There's this moment where you're like, we're the same.
Right.
And so it seems to me that there's something there. Do you want to just comment on kind of like how you think of yourself as a writer, and kind of your identity as a writer? Or maybe we've been over that. But do you think there's anything else that this poem kind of shows?
So, I mean, you qualify this as a poem. This one I would actually think more of as creative nonfiction, I suppose.
Okay.
Not because it's, not poetry. This is a weird thing, but like for me,
Sort of like a lyric essay.
Yeah, it's closer to lyric essay in its content and its structure.
Okay.
Now I know that there are poems that are open letters. And like honestly, formally, it's closer to a dramatic monologue than anything else.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, but I would say that it's closer to creative nonfiction, partially because yes, I've created this character out of whole cloth. Meanwhile, the character of Stinky Pete is a real person, and Stinky Pete is the real nickname for him. But like, I think it's because I'm not concerned necessarily with how it looks on the page, which is a thing that I think sort of differentiates from me the difference between poetry and other forms of creative writing and literature, that there's not a concern in my part for the visual organization of the words. Beyond that, there's paragraphs, but the paragraphs again are like, I would expect the same amount from traditional fiction writing, and I don't think this is fiction because obviously there's too much of it that's like verifiably true and based in reality. Not the least of which being like all the things that happen in my car are things that actually happen.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. We did pick a very specific set of pieces for this class that we thought would be maybe more appropriate and be more fruitful for conversation. I have a lot more work that I showed to May that I thought maybe you guys might want to see, that was more surrealistic and more dark and a little less grounded. And she didn't like it as much.
So maybe something of my taste is coming out here as well, that I'm interested maybe in some of this more detailed, kind of lengthier work.
Yeah, and I think it's probably also, there's some value to you as an instructor to have something where the main narrative is very explicit. Like as a student, sometimes the things that you're learning from a poem it's going to be easier to learn it from a poem that is not necessarily hiding what it's trying to do. So the work that's more accessible is maybe more useful to you as a beginning writer if you're trying to crib techniques from it. And to be fair, I do this all the time, right? Like the Deoverdose poem stole its entire structure and its content from Roger Robinson. I happen to have someone else who died in my life, so it was valuable. But like, when I was in college, especially, I would mostly read a book of poems by somebody, and then I would try to write at least one poem, copying their style or copying their structure or copying multiple of those parts. And I found that to be a very fruitful exercise that would show me sort of where my own strengths were and what my own interests were. And I would strongly endorse it.
Yeah, let's talk about inspiration then. I think that's a really good segue. And kind of, how do you find writing inspiration? I know that you're saying that you use other people's work as kind of like formal templates, or you kind of take from other writers, and I think that's a really, really important thing that I would encourage everyone to do, is imitate, and try to pull forms and notice what other writers are doing and try to learn from that. But what do you feel are your literary influences, and kind of what have you gained from them?
Oof, that's an excellent question.
What do you think you could recommend students as well? I think maybe that's like maybe a little nicer way of framing the same question.
Okay, yeah. I mean, one thing I will say is that like one thing I was worried about was trying to be original, even as I was copying all these people. But what I found reliably is that my own particular failures as an artist meant that anytime I imitated, I naturally had to make certain concessions because I didn't have the skills. And those concessions that I made, those ways that like I was an imperfect adaptation, like changing the tercets to quatrains, right? That made the poem mine. So it's fine to copy somebody else. You'll still produce things that you find are acceptable as art. Another thing is that like inspiration for me at least comes from really radically different places. So like I have poems where I'll be melding multiple different media in terms of ideas. Like there's a poem that Amay loves that's we're not going to bother here because it's not designed to be read aloud. It's a very silly piece called "Things Dogs Would Tell Me If Dogs Were Commercial Radio," right? And like half of that poem comes from a Charles Bukowski piece where he at one point just gets sick of representing like a conversation between two people, and so he just turns them into barking dogs. And just says "bow wow" for like 2 lines, and then the other half of it literally comes from like me watching animated sitcom called The Simpsons, like from 10 years ago, where Bart Simpson has to write on a board 1,000 times, like, "I will not write subliminal messagors," right? So like around the same time as the election between Al Gore and George Bush. So it's like, it was that one visual gag mixed with this other moment from a different poem that created an entire piece on its own. So don't be afraid of drawing from any art that has stuck with you. I've drawn a lot from video games. I've drawn a lot from movies, from music, from comic books, even from things that are like completely unrelated. I have a poem that's even online. You can link to it. Morning Person, which is like a choreographed poem, where the original idea came from watching somebody else's choreo poem to know that the format existed, but all of the choreography comes from actual dance moves that I was doing as part of dance groups in high school and college, and like martial arts. So like I don't think you have to be too limited. Read widely and read voraciously. I will say like there's certain writers I fucking love because they do things that are weird. And when something sticks out to me as like I've never seen anything like it, I love that, and it stays with me forever. So one thing I would strongly recommend to your readers is, if you have the time, there is a novella by a writer called Matthias Svalina, called "I Am a Very Successful Entrepreneur." And it does that great thing that I have done in I hope, in these past 3 pieces, where he effortlessly, I mean, I don't do it effortlessly, he does it effortlessly. He straddles the line between both comedy and drama, but he also straddles the line between poem, prose, like sort of like right in the middle there. They're like almost like prose poems. Everyone is usually a page. I think the first one's 3 pages, but everything after that is a half a page or a page, maybe 200 words long, and they're all like these short monologues called that are like, I started a business, but every business that he starts are businesses that are impossible. Like I started a business, installing locks on clouds, or like I started a business, you know, mortgaging temporary blindness to people. And then like goes into like absurd amounts of detail about how it happens. But the narrator of who started all these businesses is also not Matthias Felina. Like Matthias Felina does not have a wife or children, but the narrator has a wife and I think like a dead son, and like he sort of mentions them offhand. So you have this weird sort of meta narrative between these different business pitches he's describing. But like the whole book is like, I don't know, 70 pages long. And it's like 50 of these different mini business anecdotes that you're getting, and they're all hilarious and also deeply moving and also insane. So I would recommend him. Anne Carson, I love. She's a great example of someone who draws from multiple influences. Her book, Autobiography of Red, draws on the Greek myth of Heracles and his 13 labors, but instead of focusing on Heracles, she focuses on Geryon, which is a monster that he kills as like his 8th labor, who like in the original Greek, all they say about Geryon is that he was like red and had wings. But then she makes up a whole fake set of Greek poems that were written about Geryon that were like one stanza long, and then like fake translates them from Greek. And that's the preface to the book. And those are amazing. And then she writes the rest of the book as like a novel in verse told from the perspective of Geryon, who's like a gay photographer and still a demon, but like living in Argentina, who falls in love with a Greek tourist named Heracles, right? Like just a complete like topsy-turvy, turning on its head kind of piece of work. So like that was a fantastic piece. Oh, and of course, I have to mention, because we're talking about, I make a lot of jokes, right? And I haven't mentioned anything comedic, but there are great comedic writers from like traditional comedy sources. Of course, stand-up is great, but I think especially in poetry, it's good to see some. So I would look up Jennifer Knox. She has an amazing poem called Hot Ass Poem. Yeah. Do you have that poem? Can you read that, Ame? I think it'd be great.
You want me to read it? Okay, yeah, I'll read it.
It's designed for a woman to read, I think.
Yeah, okay. Is your like, okay, yeah, I'll find it. Give me one moment to bring that up. It's quite, Jennifer Knox.
So this one's really short, guys. I'll let you know. It's one sentence long. So she should be able to wrap this up in about 90 seconds, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. It's called Hot Ass Poem. Hey, check out the ass on that guy. He's got a really hot ass. I'd like to see his ass naked with his hot naked ass. Hey, check out her hot ass. That chick's got a hot ass. She's a red hot ass chick. I want to touch it. Hey, check out the ass on that old man. That's one hot old man ass. Look at his ass, his old man ass. Hey, check out that dog's ass. Wow, that dog's ass is hot. That dog's got a hot dog ass. I want to squeeze that dog's hot dog ass like a ball, but a hot ball, a hot ass ball. Hey, check out the ass on that bird. How's a bird get a hot ass like that? That's one hot ass bird ass. I want to put that bird's hot ass in my mouth and swish it around and around and around. Hey, check out the ass on that bike. Damn, that bike's ass is H-O-T. You ever see a bike with an ass that hot? I want to put my hot ass on that bike's hot ass and make a double hot ass bike ass. Hey, check out that building. It's got a really, really, really hot ass. And the doorman and the ladies in the information booth and the guy in the elevator got themselves a buttload of hot ass. I want to wrap my arms around the whole damn hot ass building and squeeze myself right through its hot ass and out the other side. I want to get me a hot ass piece of all 86 floors of hot, 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 hot ass! Exclamation point. So yeah. All right. You want to explain some of this piece to us? I'm happy to read it, but I think you probably got an analysis of the poem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing your students probably guessed this. This poem, by the way, is like fucking 25 years old. So way before the Me Too movement, way before people were stepping up against street harassment and catcalling culture, she just kind of lays out the absurdity of objectification and how like performative and almost abstract it is from real human experience in like one sentence, which is fucking amazing. I'm sorry if I'm getting like a little bit too pretentious liberal here, but like it's very clearly like a sort of a feminist poem to me, by kind of parroting and laying bare how stupid it is when you hear like catcalling dudes. But rather than take the tack that I think most people would, where they're like focusing on like how it's actually about your small penis, blah blah blah. She's left all that psychoanalysis out because like it's not even worth it for her. Like it's just like, this is how absurdly stupid that way of speaking is about literally anything, you know?
Mm.
So she starts off with like the woman and then does that for maybe half a second and then immediately does it to a man, which like, yeah, that's maybe funny, maybe not. Like I'm sure that kind of objectification and catcalling might also happen to men. But then like once we take it to like a bird or a dog or a building or baseball, like it's like I don't know. It's great. It makes me laugh. It has so much energy, and like it's not something where it's ramming you over the head with its message. It just kind of like lets you get the joke and then steps out.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think it's interesting to look at this as an example of a formal device as well. So like what it does is it takes the cat call or saying, oh, hey, like that bit in that Michael, what is it? That movie where Al Pacino's like, hey, she's got a great ass or whatever. It takes that moment and instead of thinking about it as like a kind of communication of meaning, it takes it as a form and then just starts applying it to less and less kind of recognizable scenarios until at the end it's like a hot ass building with 86 floors of hot building ass.
Yeah.
And so and so I think that's really helpful because basically it's what we're doing as writers is like we're finding literary forms and literary artifacts in the world around us, things that can be made into literature,
Yeah.
and kind of thinking about how we deploy that.
Well, the creative approach that she's using here is actually one that I would think of less in the brainy intellectual sense, and to me, it almost seems more like improvisational comedy, where there's a
Okay.
very basic concept of just yes anding, right? Like you take
Mm,
whatever the notion is and you affirm it, and then just keep the ball rolling. And like
mm-hmm.
if you do that, like you're already going to go to a place that's going to reveal some hidden truth. That's the kind of nice part about writing is that if you're doing it in a way that like is honest and sort of pushing or exploratory, you will find something.
Yeah.
So it's like she doesn't have to necessarily know that she's going to be writing about feminism before it does it. Like she could just be reacting to like
Cultural messaging that's circulating about, yeah.
Yeah, just hearing that once and being like, ugh. Like even when I hear it, the way that that hot, like it almost feels like a dog barking at me.
Mm.
And like it could just be like I can imagine myself being in the same position, being like, oh, I just want to write a poem where I sound like a dog barking.
Right.
Like just a really excited dog fucking running up on people, like over eager to see them, but like with my words. And I've seen the same thing by Jamila Woods, where she has one called Pigeon Man about like a homeless guy who like,
Yeah, and she
but like,
personifies the pigeon.
yeah, and she kind of does the pigeon walk, like where she kind of like ogles people and sort of does the craning of the neck and the eye movements and everything else. Um, so like sometimes just like focusing on those the smaller physical things can be a window into it. You don't have to like have the hot take before you write the poem. I rarely do.
Right, and I think that's the important thing is like you get somewhere through the writing process. Okay, maybe we'll just stop in just a minute because we're hitting like a half hour or like a 90-minute mark, and maybe that's a good moment to wrap up. But before we do that, I wonder, you were just saying like you inevitably get somewhere if you start writing. Like you just don't know what's going to maybe happen, or it's kind of like a transformative process or a discovery process. We've been using the metaphor of archaeology in our class a little bit, in terms of like digging, and also because it comes from that book by Jeff Cass and Scott Beale where they're talking about creative writing archaeology. Yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments on that, because I know you're also an educator as well as a writer.
I think it's a wonderful book. I think it's a great approach, in particular for beginning writers. That like I don't think you have to always write about yourself. I think it's very effective for introductory writers because like people always tell you to write what you know, and you definitely know you. Right? Which I mean, I guess as like a psychotherapist would disagree with that, but like you are by any account, the expert on your own experience. So it's always a safer place to start writing, and you're less likely to potentially misrepresent people in a way that might be potentially harmful if you're writing about your own experience. That said, I think underneath lends itself obviously towards poetry writing. If you're trying to make the transition into fiction writing, you do have to take like a slightly different approach. where you are still trying to discover things in your writing, but you are not beholden to write the thing that is right or good. It's enough to just write something that you find entertaining or fun for yourself. You know, and it might just be the exploration of how can I make a character that is a psychotic killer, or can I make a character that is going to jump places? Um, and then like, you know, this is sort of a corollary to it, which is like if you're first discovering writing, there's sort of this feeling that we are talking about different stages in the writing process, as if they're the same, where like there's a different discussion to be had if you're talking about deciding what to publish versus deciding what to write. And I think there's a value in writing almost no matter what happens. You know, it's not always necessarily the right decision to publish, but it is almost always the right decision to write it out.
Okay.
But if you're unsure or if you don't feel comfortable, I would say just go for it. You don't always have to share it, but at least you've done it, and then you'll you know that can help you as a stepping stone towards the thing that you might write later in the future.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much for being here with us, Gahl. Do you have any last comments?
You know, I'm sorry that I couldn't meet you guys in person, but I'm really happy to be able to contribute to, I guess, your journey. And you know, I hope in the future, if it's possible, I would love to see any of the work that you guys produce and to hear what you guys thought about this. Thanks. Bye.
Awesome. Okay, bye.